Welcome everybody to the Council-led Housing Forum webinar on handover and aftercare. You'll appreciate in the webinar format we're only as good as our internet connections, so please bear with us in case we drop out. This forum was set up to support the London boroughs in delivering new council housing, either directly or through their companies or their ALMOs. And our sessions are particularly aimed at helping practitioners, so we want to talk about and help you with real delivery. Today's session in particular is aimed at junior staff, those sort of newer to this part of the development process, or those perhaps in support functions. And it's the fourth and final one in a mini-series that we've done, taking us through the development process. So I'm Visika Sri Chandrasekhara, and I'm the Council-led Housing Forum Manager for Future of London. Future of London, in case you don't know us, we were set up by the London boroughs, and we're a network for the built environment, and we do all of our work is providing boroughs with support, as well as our cross-sector partners, on knowledge, leadership and networking. None of what we do in this session, I would like to add, is without support. So we're sponsored by the GLA, by Redloff, Potter Raper and BPTW Architects. Next slide. So our agenda today, it's really an agenda of two halves. So in the first half, you've got my intro, and then we're going to our main presentation. And then we have a break in the middle, a 10-minute break. And then we come back and we're into a Chatham House section of this, which is firstly a council case study and then a Q&A and solution surgery. And by that I mean that you can ask any questions on this topic, you know, either from what you've heard from our presenters, or maybe if you want to, you know, related to your own experience or a particular problem that you have currently on a scheme. So all of those questions are welcome. So I'm just going to move on and talk a little bit about housekeeping. So the first half of the webinar is recorded. And will go up on YouTube, and that means you can watch it again. You'll also get a copy of the slide deck, so you don't feel that you need to write everything down. You will be able to, you will have the presentation slides as well. I'll talk about this again in a minute, but the Q&A, which I just mentioned, we do want you to ask questions throughout using the Q&A function. And we'd like to know who you are ideally, so if you could give us your name and your organisation, and also if a question is directed for one of the speakers and you want them to specifically to answer, then do let us know that in your question as well. If you lose connection, hopefully we won't lose connection, but it can happen to any of us, just re-click the link that we sent you and it should bring you straight back in. And at the end of this webinar, you will get a feedback form, and we're really keen to get your feedback. We are learning all the time how to make our webinars better, and so we're interested both in terms of how we structured it, as well as the content as well. We want to know what you thought about that and how useful it was, particularly to you as practitioners and needing to do the kind of work that we're talking about in your day-to-day jobs. Okay, so let's just have a quick look here. Here's the, just in case you're not familiar, at the bottom of your screen, we've just got a yellow circle there around the Q&A. So at any point during this session, you can put a Q&A up. We will be gathering the questions for the Q&A part of the agenda. If we get a chance to squeeze any in between, we might do that too. Okay, so please don't forget that. We really want to hear from you. And we really want to know more about what you think and who you are as well. So we're going to start by giving you a poll. So in a moment, I'm going to launch the poll. But I'm going to bring that up right now. So we'll be coming back to those polling questions during our main presentation. So next slide, please. And I'm now going to introduce our main presenter is Paula Heatley. She's Assistant Director, New Homes and Quality at Peabody. Paula's biog you will have seen. Hi, Paula. Paula's biog you will have seen on the agenda we sent to you last week. And before I hand over to Paula, I'm just going to give Paula the feedback from the first question. So that first question we asked you was, what is your minimum timescale for a successful handover and occupation plan? By far the majority of you said 6 months was the minimum. That was 71%. And then we had 21% for 3 months and just 8% on 4 months. So I'm going to leave those statistics with our expert Paula and hand over for your main presentation. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you about something that's very close to my heart. You will have seen my bio, but I've spent a lot of my development career working at various different stages of the process. And I think the one thing that I'm particularly passionate about when it comes to handover and aftercare is it really does focus you on the why behind what we are doing. And I think it's a really interesting question that I put in the poll, and it is a bit of a trick question because the real and true answer to that question is we should be planning for our residents moving in and for everything that they will need for us right from the day we start thinking about that project. We should always start with the end in mind. But what we're going to talk about in this presentation is really the true operational elements of what may be involved in that. And that's where the sort of answers to that question, to the poll question, really come in. It really does take time and detail. Managing and planning for occupation and for the aftercare phase of your development is a project in itself, and hopefully you'll see that as we go through. It's impossible for us to go through absolutely every detail and absolutely everything that can go wrong and everything you need to plan for. I think mostly because we are really talking about human beings here. We're talking about human beings that are experience one of the most stressful times of their life. We all know, I'm sure we've all moved house at some time. It is very stressful. And what we really want to do is be really planned and really thoughtful about those considerations. And really make sure that this development that we've worked for in some cases many years, really is able to be successful. And having a good occupation phase, a good aftercare phase, can really make or break a development. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things, and I'll give you some of the examples of where developments that I've worked on and my team have worked on have gone wrong. I think in my development career, I must have moved in tens of thousands of residents into homes, and so I've seen many of the things, and I'll try and share some of those experiences with you today. So if we go on to the next phase, next slide please. So you've heard me talk about it. Early planning and preparation is key. And I really can't stress this enough. You want to be thinking every decision you make on your project, every interaction you have, you always want to be thinking about how is this going to impact my residents. But as you get closer and closer to your occupation date, to your practical completion date, you really want to be thinking about how does this impact my residents? How is this going to impact my organisation's ability to manage this? And how can I best prepare my organisation, myself, my whole project team, and most importantly, my future residents for this period. And as I'm sure you can imagine, we'll talk about some of the action planning and things in a little while, but as I'm sure you can imagine, that is no mean feat. So always anticipate and prepare for delays, just in case. We're going to talk about it. You saw a question in the poll around delays. I'd like to say that they rarely happen, but they generally, a delay on a project will generally happen more often than not, and for a wide range of reasons. Some of those things that are in our control or can be tightly managed, and we can minimise the impact that they have. And again, I'll give you some tips and advice on that from my own experiences later. But really managing and anticipating and preparing for delays, and almost assuming that they will happen, to help you manage the expectations. Most importantly, help you manage the expectations of residents. And I think, you know, we're talking about a wide range of tenures. I think you all have people who are so desperate to move because they're on the housing waiting list. They may be in emergency accommodation. They may be statutory homeless. You may have, you know, some of you may have sales and purchasers who have mortgage offers expiring. You know, people may have given up their existing home. They may be living on a sofa for whatever reason. A lot of people, almost everyone, will be desperate to get into that new home. And so managing those expectations around that with your organisation and with everyone that's going to interact with those residents is really, really important. But also doing everything you possibly can as a project manager, as someone in that project team, to minimise the impact that delay can happen as much as you possibly can. High quality homes are key to success. I think, I can't stress this enough. It sometimes is easy to just let something go just so we can get that home over the line. And this is perhaps one of the conflicting pressures with delay. Quite often we're so desperate to get something over the line. We've experienced a whole range of delays for various reasons. And so it's just easy to let something go, or not check something, or perhaps not do such a high quality snag or a de-snag. But that will cause you problems later down the line if you're not really diligent about that. So no matter how much pressure you're under from a time point of view, you do need to make sure you're building in time to deliver the best quality that you can. You know, defects ultimately are a result of ourselves and our contractors, our supply chain, not delivering to achieve the best quality. Quite frankly, our residents deserve better, but we also deserve better. We don't want to have a beautifully designed, really well planned, really thoughtful development for it to only fall over from a reputation point of view because it just has lots of snags or lots of qualities. It's got lots of leaks. That has a real impact on our customers' lives, but it also has a real impact on the scheme as a whole, and you know, our ability to deliver. And I think the important thing, and I've seen this so many times, is if you do have a high volume of defects because you haven't really focused on getting the absolute best quality, or perhaps you thought you have but something's been missed, the contractor hasn't quite delivered what you thought, I think it can really eat up a lot of your time that you should be able to be focusing in on other elements of this scheme, or perhaps the other schemes that you're working on. And I think I've touched on it and I've mentioned it many times. A real resident-led approach by all stakeholders is really important at every step of your project, whether you're 6 months ahead, whether you're 2 years ahead, or you're 5 years ahead, wherever you're at with your scheme. You can't ever lose focus on what you're doing this for. We are doing this to house people. We are doing this to give people homes, and we can never lose contact or never lose touch with that fact. It's incredibly important, and we should always be thinking about the people who will live in those homes. So the questions that you really want to be asking yourself are: how are you going to achieve a seamless approach to occupation and the management of a defects period? And there will be various different considerations, and I'll today try and give you as many sort of thoughts and ideas that you might need to help prepare you for that. But you want to be really thinking about that, and thinking about all the things that could go wrong, but all the things that need to happen is a really healthy and good way to start building on your action plan. I've said here you'll need a minimum of 6 months to prepare for this phase, but hopefully I've got it through to you. The earlier the better. You can't anticipate sometimes the complexity associated with going through this process. There will be a lot of data and handover of data that needs to happen in order to for you to manage it, for your organisation to manage these schemes and these residents. There'll be lots of other third parties that need to be involved. So the more time you build in for yourself to allow all of those dependencies and all of those third parties to do what they need to do as well, the more chance you've got of delivering this successfully. And creating that project team of internal and external stakeholders, including a critical path with clear owners to ensure all actions are delivered. And I'm going to talk to you in more detail on the next slide, so we'll move over onto that now. So don't worry, you can't see the detail on this slide. I know you've all received a copy of this spreadsheet. So this is just indicative of this is the time now for you to be looking at that spreadsheet. What I really want to draw your attention to is really the activities area of the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet in itself includes lots of detail about the scheme, the useful information, and just to be really clear, this is just one example. You may want to use something like this, you may want to use something you've already got in place. It really doesn't matter. This is just an example of how you can really action plan. And the really important thing when you're action planning for all the steps that that need to be taken into consideration are what area of your organisation, your business, or your project team. So it could be that you're outsourcing some of that activity. Where does it sit? Who owns it? Who's the point of escalation if it doesn't go right? Who do you start to work through and manage that? What is the activity that's going on, and really who do you need to rely on? What are the dependencies? So if something doesn't happen, who then needs to pick up to rectify that situation? So I think that's something that's really important, because quite often, and you'll see there's a column within this spreadsheet that says this activity cannot start before another activity has been completed. And I think sometimes you'll have whole chains of activities, and something that really critical that needs to happen can fall over because several of the activities before that haven't taken place. And this is generally quite typical of normal project management anyway, but it's really important when you get to this stage of the planning, because as we've talked about and as I've really stressed, this is people's homes, it's people's lives, emotions will run very high, and when things go wrong, when you haven't really considered something, when you perhaps have missed something, that's when you can really struggle with not making sure that things happen as they should. So again, just an indication of how you may want to do it. This is an action plan that that's been used in Peabody, where I work for many years. Actually, we have now moved to something that is much more simple, as we've got people who have skills and experience, and it's much slicker process. However, this was a really great starting point for us. So when we were really building our aftercare function, probably 6 years ago now, having this level of detail was really helpful. And I think aftercare functions look different in different organisations. It really doesn't matter what your setup is in your organisation. What matters is having ownership for all of the things that need to happen and ensuring that they do them. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide. So there are some key things that I've drawn out of that action plan that I think are really critical. So some of the considerations that you really want to think about. So the first one is how, when, and by whom will the properties be advertised? And then we've talked about separate considerations for homes for sale. So just for argument's sake, I'm going to focus on lettings and general needs rental products now. There will be a range of activities that need to happen. Your allocations, your lettings team will need a set of data in order to advertise that property. How is that data going to get over to them? Who's going to collect that data? What is it they need? Is it even all ready? They may need certain things that just aren't ready at that stage. So how are we going to get all of that information, and how are we going to ensure that they get it? Because again, thinking about the dependencies, if they don't have what they need, then they won't be able to advertise the properties. And at that point onwards, that will start to have a trickle-down effect on your ability to occupy those homes. Not only will that mean in this circumstance, with this example that we've got, that that residents who desperately need housing won't get housing as quickly as they need it, but also our organisation is going to be collecting rental voids that are really unavoidable and really don't need to happen. So really thinking about that and making sure that those properties are getting advertised on time. And again, I talked about separate considerations for homes for sales. Homes for sales and the marketing phase will take place in a lot of organisations at least 2 years pre-completion, at least, and that will really be a thought process that your sales and marketing team, should you be delivering homes for sale, will be thinking about, and you'll need to be working with them really far in advance of that. So there is a whole separate work stream that will need to be thought through for that. So how about viewing? So once you've got the property advertised, people have applied, maybe through choice-based lettings, maybe through another forum, depending on the tenure, the mix, and the strategy. But you will have to coordinate viewings. Now, the best and most optimum way to get residents ready and signed up is to have viewings with the scheme on site, and that helps minimise voids. But that arranges a whole level of complexity around having safe access for viewings, having a look what's in your contract. Do you even have the contractual ability to do that? If not, can you arrange something? If you can't do that, if you have to wait for practical completion, how are you going to organise and manage that as slickly and as quickly as possible with the teams that are going to be coordinating those viewings? And then how are you going to then lead those viewings, turn those viewings into conversions, into sign-ups? The other thing I really want to talk about is creating home user guides. Home user guides, home guides, they all have all kinds of different names, but essentially they are a manual that your customers will have, and it will really help them to know how to use their home, how to interact with everything on their estate, but also any local amenities and lots of different things as well. So the real benefit of these is that you'll have everything that they may need to contact you. They may need to raise defects. They may need to stop them raising defects if it's genuinely not a defect. So helping them understand how to manage and maintain their home. You know, you could have guidance on troubleshooting for particular complex pieces of equipment. You know, a lot of new build homes now have things like ventilation, so you could have mechanical ventilation. They will have, you know, maybe heat interface units for a communal heating system. They'll have things in there that residents might not necessarily be used to interacting with. So having troubleshooting guides and having guides within them does really help minimise the amount of defects and inquiries that come in afterwards. We've talked about it already, but planning reasonable timescales for snagging and desnagging. You know, a good quality snag takes time. You really do want to look at every nook and cranny. Ideally, and this is really an ideal world, we don't like to do more than 6 homes a day. And I think this really does depend. You may have spent a lot of time working through quality on that scheme. You may have a really good trusted relationship and with your contractor, and they may be delivering great quality for you. Don't assume. You will know. You usually generally feel in your gut if you're getting what you really think you should be getting. But you know, if you are in that situation and you are feeling great about quality, you may be able to increase that. It will also depend. Sometimes there's things within contracts that restrict your ability to take that level of time. Generally you'll have a good benchmark snag unit, and you should really spend your time on that one. And you know, for us that could take a whole day to get the benchmark snag right. So you really want to be making sure that you're working through this. I think, and these are the reasons why you want to build in time. You know, time up front will save you far more time down the line. I think the important considerations are, don't be afraid to walk away. You know, I've had some quite extreme situations. There's a particular site I was working on myself, or the employees agent hadn't been for a couple of weeks. We were feeling a little bit, we're not quite sure about this one. It's not quite progressing as we want it to, but we gave the contractor the benefit of the doubt. We turned up to do our snagging. They were adamant on that morning before we turned up, yep, we're ready for you, come along, it'll be great, la la la. We turned up and some of the kitchens hadn't even been fitted and they wanted us to snag. So, you know, of course, in that situation, we walked away. We absolutely weren't willing to snag it. You know, there's just no circumstances of that ever okay. But that's quite an extreme example. There are, you know, lots of examples where you turn up, you start to snag the unit, and before you've even got, you know, out of one room, or before you've even got off one wall, you might have a whole page. You know, you really want to be thinking, what am I happy with here? And usually, you know, if we're doing the first snag, the first time we've gone into that unit, and we're getting, you know, more than a page of items before we even come out of one room, we wouldn't be happy with that. And the important thing to remember is, if you're a client organisation, you shouldn't be doing your contractors snag for them. You know, you should be doing your clients snag. They should have already gone through and delivered a good quality unit for you. They are presenting it to you as a finished product almost at that stage. So this is about you polishing it. You shouldn't be doing their snag for them. And if you feel that that's the case, then you want to walk away and say, no, we'll come back next week, go and spend a bit more time on it, and do that. And don't be afraid to do that. Again, in times when programs are tight, this can be really difficult. It can be a really difficult message, particularly if a contractor is going to experience delays, are going to experience financial penalties because of delays. They'll be really reluctant to do that. You know, so work with your employer's agent, look at what's in your contracts. But if they've presented something to you that's not good enough, you really want to be working on how can you ensure that you're getting the product that you need. And again, when you're building in that client snag into your program, you want to make sure the contractor then has enough time to do everything that you've asked them to do. So ensure that there's time to desnag there as well. And then something that is becoming more and more important, yesterday the building safety bill was released, but you want to ensure that you've got time to plan for all of your landlord responsibilities, and ensure that your teams that are going to be delivering that have everything they need, have done everything they need. Do you have all of your M&E compliance checks? Have you got a fire risk assessment in place? And that's particularly relevant to blocks of flats. Going forward, and for those of you that have had the opportunity to look at the building safety bill, there will be a requirement in some point in the next few years for us to start registering buildings with the building safety regulator before we occupy, and it is a criminal offence not to do so, or it isn't yet, but it will be a criminal offence not to do so. So there will be lots of different layers around, you know, a regulatory responsibility as a landlord and duty holder responsibilities around occupation and compliance that you will really need to think through, and you'll have to build that into your programme as you're planning for occupation. It will be very critical. But even before that new regulation hits, there are requirements that you need to be considerate of right now. So we now have another poll question. So.
Hi Paula, I'm back. I was just on mute then. So yes, let's go to poll question 2, which was about delays. So the question was, what do you think are the main causes of delay on residential construction projects? And there really could be so many answers to this question, I think, which is why the handover and aftercare process is so difficult to manage. But we only gave 3 options to our audience. The two most popular ones were, firstly, the option utility connections and commissioning. And I have to say, it's one I regularly hear about, you know, can we get the stats connected? And the second one is really chimes with what you've just speaking about, de-snagging, building control, NHBC sign-off. And of course, as you've just mentioned, in future, there's going to be the whole building safety registration process, as well as your fire safety within that, which is going to have to need particular attention, particularly for blocks of flats. And of course, in London, we are predominantly building blocks of flats, so I think this is going to have a huge impact. And then lastly, but at 25%, people mentioned legal issues and planning conditions. So, you know, still a bit of a really big issue, and there are a lot more issues, aren't there, to come. So, Paula, I'll hand back over to you.
Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please. So let's talk about delay, and thank you very much for answering those questions. I think again, and there will be a little theme coming through here, it was really a trick question. All of those things are things that can cause delay, and it's almost impossible to say what's going to cause delay on what scheme, because they probably all can. And as we go through some of these examples that we've just had in the poll, but also I've got in this slide here, I'll talk about some of my experiences around delay and where delay has caused problems for things that have perhaps felt at the time outside of our control. They felt like we were relying on third parties. But it's really important actually to look back at your experiences and to work through the scheme and take those learnings and think about what you could have done differently. Because as a client organisation, there's always things that you can do just to make sure you're putting the right checks and balances in place to ensure that you're considering everything that you need to. So I think the most important thing is to have both a good construction program, but also to have a good, almost a management program from a client point of view, to ensure that you've got all of your things that need to happen for you to complete that scheme are tracked and managed. And so regular scrutiny of those elements is really important. I think a lot of this does come with experience, but as you go and you start visiting that site and you look around the activity that's going on, and then you cross-reference that with the program that you've been given by your contractor, you can usually see if the activities that are dictated on that program are the activities that are happening. You know, if your program tells you that they should have been fitting windows now for 6 weeks and they have only got a few panes in, that really tells you that there could be some delay there. So you really want to start challenging and working through that. And like I said, some of that does come with experience, especially if you're not familiar, you haven't spent a lot of time out on construction sites, but it is something that you've got the tools there to start really helping you to ask the questions. And I think, you know, right when I think back to when I was early on in my development career, you know, I used to be a bit fearful of asking those questions, because I think perhaps it's obvious, perhaps it only takes 2 days to fit 5,000 window panes, but the reality and the thing that I really learned is it really isn't a stupid question, and don't take anything that any information that you're being given for granted. Don't just assume that is going to happen. We work with some amazing contractors and we work with some really, really great partners, but at the end of the day, the commercial organisations, and delay costs money, they know that. So there is quite often, it's very common to be told something that actually doesn't end up materialising. And because you're relying on that programme and the dates that are dictated within that programme and everything that you're happening, and we talked about the action plan, we talked about all of the dependencies and all of the information that fundamentally is going to the residents that are there and waiting. Just something that could cause a delay will really, really have an impact on all of that, and you want to make sure that you're ready and that you're prepared as much as you can. So I can't stress enough, don't be afraid to ask a question. If it doesn't look right, it probably isn't, and you should be challenging that. I think some of the other things that I've listed here that, I've got experience of every one of these on many schemes. But legal issues, and when I talk about legal issues, this could be a whole range of things, but you really need to look at making sure you've got all your legal ducks in a row, that you're getting the right and appropriate advice. I've had particular examples where we identified there was a particular piece of the site that we didn't actually own, and we only realised really late on. We've had examples where an easement that needed to be put in place hadn't been put in place, and that was going to restrict access to our site. We've had, I'm trying to think of other things, we've had particular contractual issues that we've had to work through, lots of different examples. So there are lots of things that you really want to make sure that you've worked through, and that your legal team, your employer's agent, everyone you're working with in that project team is helping you and working through all of these things. But fundamentally, never lose ownership of the outcomes of those things. Never just think, oh, it's okay because someone else is looking after my interests there. The best thing that you can do is really understand what you're asking them to do, and really be really clear with challenging them. I always have this saying with my team, whoever does the paying does the saying. You're the client organisation, you are doing the paying, and you do need to own the requests and the information. And there's no harm in asking questions. Never feel that you can't ask a question of your consultant team and of those that are there and being paid to support you. The other thing that quite often can cause delays are planning conditions. Your scheme will come with a whole range of planning conditions that you'll need to satisfy, or your contractor will need to satisfy, and you want to work through those. You should be addressing all of your planning conditions at every site meeting, whether they're monthly or whatever your frequency is, and you should be going through those and ensuring that you're on track, that everyone who needs to be delivering planning conditions is on track, because there will be planning conditions that need to be signed off and completed before occupation. Utilities, an incredibly common one, and this is one of the things that you're really dependent on third parties with this. So your contractor may have placed their order with one of the utility providers, and for whatever reason they're experiencing delays. So really ensuring that they have placed those orders. Again, refer back to your program, have a look at what they should be doing and when they should be doing it, and just make sure that everything's on track, and that if there are any delays being caused by third parties, that again you're asking the right questions, that you're challenging, and that you're ensuring that there is a plan in place to mitigate against any impact of any delay caused by that. Again, commissioning and de-snagging. So again, we're talking mostly about blocks of flats here. Most of them will have some complex mechanical and electrical equipment in there, and I'm talking about lifts, maybe communal boilers, maybe ventilation systems, maybe all kinds of different both communal and individual plant items. And with some of those things, you won't be able to occupy your units without heating on hot water, for example. So you need to make sure that they're on track with that. I've regularly turned up for snagging and the lift is not yet commissioned, and that's always a red flag for me, because I would be really concerned if that's not very clearly in the programme, isn't clearly happening. I'd really be thinking about that. You absolutely don't want to be moving people in without a lift. I talked about snagging and de-snagging, but again, I would not snag units that didn't have water, and we have been asked to do that on many occasions. So, the water's turned off for whatever reason, you want to make sure that you're checking for leaks and all of that kind of thing. So proper commissioning and proper de-snagging is really important. Safe access, again, we've turned up for to take completion on site, and maybe the external landscaping is not ready. There are elements of that are always the last thing to do. I wouldn't personally recommend taking a scheme where you've got large amounts of external landscaping that's not done, but perhaps you've come to some arrangement, you've come to an agreement that some elements will be done post completion, and you just need to arrange safe access. Or maybe you're in a phased development where there is a neighbouring site, or the next phase is being built, and you need to make sure you've got safe access incredibly important. Again, you cannot occupy and move people in if access to those buildings is not safe. And then other things as well, and again it's similar to the planning condition, the legal issue, but you will be depending on a building control sign off. Maybe you've got an NHBC policy or similar. You want to make sure that everyone is ready, that those sign-offs have been achieved before you're even thinking about taking practical completion. Again, I've had an example where I've turned up to take practical completion one day and the building control certificate just wasn't ready. I think it was being done by the local authority at the time, and they just hadn't sent it over, so that whole day was aborted. And again, we had residents ready to move in the next day. So I think this gives you an idea about how some of those activities and those dependencies, if you leave it too close to the wire, can cause issues. And again, health and safety files and O&Ms need to be ready. Actually, there's a health and safety legislation that says they need to be provided and complete to allow you to manage that building safely and to maintain that building safely. You should not be taking occupation without all of that documentation. So making sure, as you've seen, all of these things can cause delays. And they can cause a range of issues on your scheme. So making sure that when you do come across them, and I promise you will, if you have a scheme with none of these issues on, I would be very surprised. The gods are looking in your favour for sure. But having a clear communication strategy around how you communicate that across your business, and again, fundamentally your goal is to really manage the expectations of the people that are going to be moving in, and managing the expectations of your organisation, your business that's ready to take new homes into your portfolio. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So we finally get to the actual aftercare provision, and we're getting ready to move people in, managing your defects period, and this really can be one of the most challenging parts of managing a scheme, and we've talked about it. We've made the assumption we've got great quality units. That's really the number one thing you need to be doing, so your scheme should be of the highest level of quality, but understand what your employer's requirements say around having very clear service level agreements with your contractor. So you really need to understand what they say. If you've got the opportunity to influence what is going into your employer's requirements around that, that's great. My recommendation would be to try as near as you can to match it to your repair responsibilities and your repair service level agreement. It just is much easier for everyone who's interacting. For example, if an emergency defect is done within 24 hours, and that's what you'd use for an emergency repair as well, it'd be very easy for the customer to understand through the life cycle of their occupation, very easy for your business to interact and communicate the right thing. What can be really difficult is if a customer phones up and they say, hey, I've got no heating, they raise a defect, and the customer care person at the end of the phone doesn't realise it's a scheme in defects and it's got a slightly different SLA to the normal repair responsibility, and they can mismanage expectations with the customer through no fault of their own, just because they didn't have the information. So as much as you can do to streamline and make sure those things all match up, it will be much easier. Meet with your contractor's aftercare team early, and there will be a range of different services there. You could have a big, very slick developer on a Section 106 scheme that's got all the bells and whistles with aftercare and is very clear what they're going to give you, and it may be difficult to negotiate that. You may not exactly want it exactly as they want to give you, but again, you go back to your development agreement with them. Or you could have a very small contractor on a very small scheme that doesn't even have an aftercare team, and your aftercare team is getting the mobile phone number for the site manager who worked on it, and then you work through that. You'll get everything and everything in between those two scenarios. So, but understanding what the offer is, How does it fit in with your expectations for your team, for your organisation and for your customer? And whatever the situation you're faced with, you know, you may not, and in most circumstances, by the time we've got to this stage, we can't then have the ability to make changes to the contractual arrangements, but we may be able to have the conversations and get something set up that works for everyone. So just be really clear, plan that and meet with them as early as you can to start doing that. And again, I would recommend if you can get a meeting 6 months in advance, because if there is a negotiation to be had on how you're doing it, if your very small contractor does need to go and procure a service to provide that, because that's what they're contractually obligated to do, or that's what you're asking them to do, then you want to give them time to do that. And you also want to have time to have the ability to step in if you need to. So there are situations where contractors won't manage defects well, and you want to have the ability to step in and go and resolve those defects. Otherwise, the teeth that are in your contract to allow you to do that almost is invalid because you're not triggering that. So you want to make sure you've got that plan in place and that you know how you're going to deal with it all if it goes wrong. Thinking about how residents will report defects and how will the contractor be notified. So will they go through a call centre? Will they call your development team directly? Will they call the contractor directly? How is that going to be set up and arranged? And making sure that whatever that arrangement is, all of the information is provided. You know, I think there's been many situations, I've worked in many different client organisations that have had situations where they just haven't had those properties set up on the system. So when the customer calls the organisation to raise a defect, and they may have water pouring through their home, they could have someone trapped in a lift, it could be a really big emergency, and they can't even find the property, so they assume it's not theirs, and that is purely a data issue. So all of that planning and preparation and testing, you know, do a test call in, if it's going through a call centre, do a test call. Hi, I'm calling from, you know, 10 Green Street, and you know, I need to raise a defect. How does that run? Does it run smoothly? Having a plan for out of hours emergency provision and any non-defect issues that may occur. So you need to make sure you've considered out of hours. Believe me, and you know, I have had calls at 2 o'clock in the morning, happens all the time. The biggest emergencies always happen out of hours, on a bank holiday, on Christmas Day, whatever it is. You know, even just, you know, overnight. You need to have a plan. How are you going to respond to that? Is your contractor ready and able to drop into that? If not, what's your backup plan? Do you have the ability to send your repairs contractors out if you have an emergency? Because you do not want, and I think I really learned the hard way, it was many years ago now, where we had a situation on a scheme where we had sewage backing up into someone's property and we didn't respond for way too many hours because we just hadn't thought about a backup plan if the contractor didn't turn up. So you do need to make sure you've got all of those things considered. And you will get non-defect issues that occur. So maybe things like vandalism of a lift is quite common, people jamming doors open, again, jamming front entrance doors open, which impact the security of your block, all kinds of things. You need to have a mechanism to be able to respond to those, whether that's sending those to a repairs or maintenance contractor, or whether that's having an ability for your contractor who built your scheme for you to respond to those things and send you a charge. However you want to interact with those things, you need to have a plan in place. Who's going to lead interaction with your residents? If and when things go wrong, or even if they perfectly go well, you want to be able to communicate with your residents around those things, and you want to be able to manage that really well. You want to be for them to be able to reach out and have someone that's at the end of the phone that they can ask questions to, that they can raise issues with, rather than it just be a total call centre environment, because at some point you likely will have to drop in and be able to quickly react and fix problems. How will you manage cosmetic items raised by residents? So lots of things that get raised by residents aren't necessarily considered a defect, and they may not even be considered a snag. So depending on, you know, how you manage that, again, what's in your contract, and what kind of standard you're asking for. There may be items that a customer feels is not acceptable, but the contractor feels is within tolerance. You need to have a plan as to what you're going to do with that. You're either going to hold your line with your customers and be clear, no, this is not a problem for us, or you're going to have some mechanism to be able to deliver that, either through your own internal services, Peabody runs a handyman service to drop into things like that, but we do quite a high level of sales product within our mix, and some of those are very high value. So you have to do what's right, and you have to know what your organisation's approach is going to be, and if there isn't a common understood approach, you need to get your plan in place for that. So again, good quality inspection and robust handover. We've talked a lot about quality. But also talking about quality handover around, you can't see it on the slide here, but around specialist pieces of equipment. So if there is something that your business is not used to interacting with, maybe it's a change of heating system, and lots of that will be happening over the coming years as people move to things like ground source and air source heat pumps, that kind of thing. There will be lots of new pieces of technology. How are you going to manage that? Are you going to get a specialist, a consultant, an M&E consultant or something like that to ensure that you're ready and you're planned and you know what you've got and you've got the best quality you can? Because maybe your clerk of works on your site, or however you manage quality on that site, hasn't got experience with that piece of kit. How are you going to ensure that that happens? So we've got another poll question now.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. So we're just coming into, we've got, I think at most sort of 5 minutes because we're running slightly over, but let's just have a look at that final poll question. So that question was, what is the biggest challenge when moving multiple residents into a development at the same time? And a lot of people, obviously, particularly with big phased schemes, will be doing this. And the number one answer from our audience was communication with residents at 54%. But the other two options that we gave also, well, parking for loading and unloading as well as lift use. That was the runner-up at 38%, and multiple home demonstrations just got 8%. But they are all big challenges. I'm sure you're about to tell us that.
Yes.
So we've just got, I think if we can close in the next 5, we're probably then going to be able to take your questions in the Q&A session, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot more. So just a reminder to the audience to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. There's a lot more I know Paula can share with us. Okay, back to you, Paula.
So yes, so I'll start closing up now if we move to the next slide. So moving in residents, and within the poll you all touched on lots of things, and I think this really depends on the scheme and the scenario, but communication with existing residents, if you're working on a regen scheme, an infill scheme, and making sure that everyone on that that wider estate or the neighbouring properties is aware that you're just about to move in X, it could be hundreds of people at any one time, and managing that. And again, most people who are moving into our homes will be moving in at weekends. There'll be all kinds of different things, so you do really need to think about that, but yes, that is a big consideration. I think the other things that I've raised on here for you to really think about, but allocation for parking, for loading and unloading. People do not move house, just with a backpack, and again, there's all kinds of different scenarios, but the vast majority of people will have a lot of belongings to bring with them, and they will have a moving van. It just goes without saying. So depending on what your situation for parking is, depending on what your situation is on the estate, or you could be on a red route, you could have different arrangements there. You really need to think about that, and you may want to consider move-in slots, and it's almost the same consideration for the lift. If people are putting sofas and beds and mattresses and all kinds of things into your lift, you need to make sure that your lift can deal with that, so you may want to think about having someone there, a member of staff or a security, just manning that lift for those peak periods of time, and also thinking about protecting your communal areas and your lifts, and putting that protection, because they will get battered. I can absolutely 100% guarantee you that. One thing that we do is we always, after about 6 months, when we know everyone's moved in, we go back and redecorate our communal areas, and we always put lift protection in. So I think those are the things that you really want to think about, because people, particularly people, moving into new homes, they want it to stay nice, and they want their entranceways to look nice as well, and this is really important. So we talked about managing staff, and then the big thing is bulk waste. Again, generally when people move in, they all come with lots of things in boxes. They get hundreds of deliveries of new furniture, new TVs, all kinds of different things, and that generates more waste than you will ever see on any other normal estate. So you want to consider either additional bulk waste collections, a skip on your site for that kind of thing, working with your caretaking estate services team, your provider, your managing agent, whoever's going to be managing that waste on the long term, and up the ante around those move-in periods to make sure you're ready. And home demonstrations, you know, I highly recommend doing home demonstrations for every resident. How you manage that, how you do that will depend on the scheme, your personal circumstances and your level of resources, but it really does reduce the amount of problems and issues that later come on, and you know, right from antisocial behaviour to how to use things to everything in between. There are situations where you may be signing up 10 people in a day, and believe me, if you've got one person going around and doing 10 hours of home demonstrations in a day, it's not sustainable, it's exhausting. You need to think about that. So it may not feel like a big problem, but it is something you really want to be thinking about. So if we can move on to the next slide. So the final point that I wanted to mention to you is that you really want to be thinking, as your scheme's approaching the end of defects, how are you going to manage that and hand that scheme over into management, ensuring that your business is prepared. Hopefully by now they've had many months, if not years, to get prepared for that. Ensure all of your data is going to be handed over, or any certificates that you've generated in that defects period or prior to that is handed over. That all the contracts for any pre-planned maintenance, but also responsive maintenance, are all fully set up and ready, and have a very clear plan to make sure all stakeholders have done their inspections at the end of defects, and they've raised any issues, so you're not missing that critical opportunity to raise any issues. Have a clear plan to take that scheme out of defects, because if you don't, you will be dealing with it for many years to come and you will regret it. So I promise you, you want to be thinking about that. So thank you very much.
Paula, that was fantastic. So comprehensive, and I'm sorry, you probably could have continued, couldn't you? The passion you have on this topic, really comes across. So thank you very much. It's now at this point in the agenda that we are going to say goodbye to our YouTube viewers. Thank you for having joined us. And please do go to the Future of London website and do join us again.